Adam Whitfield moved through the bustling streets of New York City. His steps deliberate, his appearance polished to perfection. On the surface, he looked every bit the wealthy, successful man he was. His dark, tailored suit hugged his frame impeccably, his shoes gleamed, and he carried himself with the confidence that came from both money and power. People stepped aside as he walked past, recognizing him instantly or simply sensing his aura of importance. He glanced up at the towering skyline, lights glinting off glass buildings like stars against a dusky sky. But beneath his flawless exterior, Adam felt anything but confident. His mind was far from the gleaming cityscape. It was weighed down by a single, unwelcome thought: the invitation to his ex-fiancée Rachel's wedding, an event that was meant to symbolize his own past and her new beginning. Rachel had been his first real love, and their lives together had once felt set in stone. Both came from wealthy families, shared a social circle, and had plans that intertwined effortlessly. They'd seemed like the perfect match, right up until the moment Rachel called it off. She left him with the haunting words that they were too similar, too stagnant, and that she needed someone who brought her something more than the sameness they shared. Those words had stayed with him, gnawing away at the carefully constructed image of himself, creating cracks in his polished exterior. Since the breakup, he'd found himself in a cycle of self-reflection, wondering if she was right. Was he really nothing more than a product of his family's wealth, a person who existed solely in boardrooms and penthouses? It was a thought he had worked hard to drown out, yet here it was again, brought to the surface by the simple, cream-colored invitation that had arrived in the mail. He'd considered not going, of course. What would be the point of putting himself through the spectacle of watching Rachel, the woman he once planned to marry, say her vows to someone else? But something in him had snapped at the thought of staying away. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was the need to show Rachel and himself that he was unaffected, that he had moved on, that he was fine. Or maybe it was something darker, an urge to reclaim a piece of his life that felt as though it had slipped away. Adam sighed and adjusted his cufflinks, trying to push the thoughts aside, but they clung to him, shadowing each step he took through the city. As he turned down a side street to avoid the traffic, his gaze landed on a figure that starkly contrasted with his own polished image. A woman in tattered clothes sitting on the sidewalk, her posture dignified despite her obvious state of homelessness. Her eyes were bright, sharp, almost defiant. And as she looked up, she met his gaze directly, unflinching. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, and Adam felt an unexpected pang of curiosity, a draw that he couldn't explain. He was used to people avoiding eye contact with him on the street, especially those who were less fortunate. But here was this woman, completely unfazed by him, studying him with a mixture of curiosity and what seemed like disdain. Without fully knowing why, Adam found himself approaching her. As he stepped closer, he noticed details about her that he hadn't from afar. Her clothes, though worn, were layered meticulously, as if she had a system that kept her protected from the elements. Her fingers, though cold and a bit cracked, were clean, and her face held traces of someone who had once taken care of herself. She didn't look away. Instead, she raised an eyebrow as he came nearer, an expression that made him feel unexpectedly self-conscious. Her confidence, her lack of fear, unsettled him. "Do you need something?" she asked, her tone neither pleading nor meek, but simply curious. He hesitated, thrown off balance by the boldness in her voice. "I'm not sure," he replied honestly, his words faltering. He shook his head, trying to regain control of the conversation. "I just noticed you here. It's rare to see someone like—" He trailed off, realizing how hollow and ridiculous he must sound. "Someone like what?" she pressed, tilting her head. There was a spark in her eyes, something that hinted at both intelligence and the kind of life experiences that couldn't be gleaned from his comfortable world. She didn't seem the least bit intimidated or impressed by him, which only intrigued him further. Adam cleared his throat, searching for something meaningful to say, but realizing that anything he could offer would likely come off as condescending or hollow. But, against his usual instincts, he decided to be vulnerable, something he rarely allowed himself to be. "Look, I'll be honest," he started, surprising even himself. "I was supposed to go to my ex-fiancée's wedding this weekend, and I think I need someone to go with me." The woman looked at him in silence for a moment, clearly sizing him up. "So, let me get this straight. You want a stranger, someone you don't know, someone from the streets, to be your date to a wedding?" Adam shrugged, realizing how absurd it sounded when said aloud. "Yes," he admitted, feeling both foolish and oddly determined. "I think you could help me make a statement. Show her that I've moved on, that I'm not as stuck as she seems to think I am." The woman laughed, a genuine, amused laugh that somehow made Adam feel both ridiculous and fascinated. "You think you can just pick me up off the street, clean me up, and use me as some kind of prop?" "No," he said quickly, feeling the weight of her words and realizing how callous he must have sounded. "No, it's not like that. I don't know. I saw something in you. You don't look at me like everyone else does. I thought maybe—" She interrupted him with a wry smile, crossing her arms. "Maybe I could help you get back at your ex?" Adam hesitated, then nodded. "Something like that. But also, I thought maybe it could be more than that. I could help you too. If you came with me, I could arrange for a place for you to stay, some new clothes, a way to get back on your feet." The woman studied him in silence, her gaze intense, as if trying to read his soul. For the first time in a long while, Adam felt vulnerable, exposed, like she could see through every carefully constructed layer he'd built around himself. She finally let out a sigh, her eyes softening, though her voice remained firm. "You have no idea what you're asking, do you?" she said, almost to herself. Adam shook his head, realizing he didn't fully understand why he was doing this, but feeling an inexplicable pull toward her. "Maybe not, but I'm asking anyway." After a long pause, the woman extended her hand. "I'm Sophie," she said simply. There was no smile, no softness in her expression, just a quiet resolve that hinted at both curiosity and an unspoken agreement to see where this strange proposition might lead. Adam took her hand, feeling a spark of connection that surprised him. "Adam," he replied, as if she didn't already know his name. For the first time in a long while, he felt a strange, liberating sense of anticipation, as though his life had just taken a turn he could never have predicted. And he couldn't shake the feeling that perhaps he had finally found the person who might help him understand what Rachel had meant all those years ago. The days that followed their unusual agreement were nothing short of surreal for Sophie. The luxury hotel room Adam had arranged for her felt like a different universe compared to the streets where she'd spent so many nights. The bed was large, plush, and dressed in sheets so soft she almost felt nervous to touch them. In the corner of the room sat a selection of clothes and accessories that Adam had ordered for her. It wasn't just the clothes, though. There were skincare products, perfumes, and makeup she hadn't even glanced at in years, things that triggered memories she'd long buried. Sophie didn't see Adam the next day, but he had sent someone to meet her, a poised, middle-aged woman named Evelyn, who was introduced as her etiquette and social coach. Sophie had felt an urge to laugh when Evelyn, in her crisp black dress and pearls, politely explained that she would be helping her navigate the social expectations of Adam's world. It sounded so far from her reality that it almost seemed like a game. But there was something about Evelyn's demeanor, her earnestness, that softened Sophie's initial skepticism. She found herself genuinely trying to listen and learn, reminding herself that this was temporary, that it was just part of an arrangement. Evelyn spent the first part of the morning simply talking to Sophie, gently asking about her life, her background, and any experiences that might help her understand social cues in Adam's world. Sophie found herself surprised at how easily she could slip back into conversations about things she hadn't discussed in years. Small talk, refined manners, the art of keeping emotions hidden beneath the surface. It was all muscle memory, really. And Sophie quickly realized she hadn't forgotten as much as she'd thought. By the end of the day, Evelyn looked at her with an approving nod, remarking that she seemed to have a natural instinct for etiquette that simply needed a little dusting off. Adam returned the following day, his eyes scanning her with a mixture of curiosity and pride. Seeing her transformed, her hair now styled, her clothes elegant yet understated, he couldn't help but feel a strange satisfaction. This was the first time he'd seen Sophie without the layers of her life on the streets, and she looked different. She looked like someone who belonged at his side, someone who could easily blend into his world without a second glance from the people around them. But there was still something in her gaze, an edge that hadn't softened, a resilience that seemed untouched by the change in her appearance. "Impressive," he said, nodding at her. "You clean up well, Sophie." She smirked, crossing her arms. "It's not exactly my first time wearing decent clothes, you know." Adam raised an eyebrow, intrigued. He'd sensed from their first meeting that Sophie wasn't what she seemed, that there was more to her story than her current circumstances. Her poise, her vocabulary, her ability to challenge him with a single look. It all hinted at a past she'd kept hidden. He wanted to ask, but there was something in her expression that warned him against prying. He'd only known her for a short time, but already he respected her boundaries, sensing that any attempt to peel back her layers would have to come on her terms. They spent the day going over details for the wedding. Adam explained the people she'd meet, the conversations she might expect, and the careful dance of interactions that defined events like this. He was surprised to find her not only willing to learn, but almost naturally adapting to it, picking up the rhythm and flow of his world as if she'd never left it. Sophie nodded along, listening intently, though her eyes sometimes wandered out the hotel room's window to the streets below. He noticed this, but didn't comment, instead simply sharing what he could to help her feel prepared. One afternoon, while taking a break from their preparation, Sophie shared a bit about herself, a carefully guarded bit of her past that left Adam in silent thought. She told him about the corporate job she once had, the responsibilities, the ambition, and the thrill of being part of something larger than herself. She didn't delve into specifics, but her words were enough to paint a picture of a life that had once been aligned with his. And though she left much unspoken, Adam felt the weight of what she had lost, the sacrifices she'd made, the price she had paid for choices that might not even have been hers to make. It stirred something in him, a feeling he wasn't used to. Compassion mixed with a deeper, unfamiliar sense of kinship. Their interactions grew easier, more natural, and Adam found himself looking forward to their sessions. She was sharp, quick-witted, and unafraid to challenge him, pointing out the absurdity in some of the unspoken rules that governed his world. He found her perspective refreshing, an antidote to the polished, scripted lives of people he typically encountered. And though he hadn't intended for this arrangement to mean anything more than a transaction, he couldn't deny the pull he felt towards her, a pull that seemed to intensify each day they spent together. In those moments of unguarded conversation, a shift began to occur. What had started as a scheme, a simple plan to ease his wounded pride, was evolving into something more complex, something he couldn't quite define. He found himself laughing with her, sharing stories he rarely told, even revealing his own insecurities about the wedding, about Rachel, about the expectations that hung over him like invisible weights. And Sophie listened, not with pity, but with understanding, with a silent acknowledgement that resonated deeply with him. He realized that she too carried invisible weights, burdens she bore without complaint, and in her presence he felt a strange, shared sense of relief. As the wedding day approached, Adam arranged for Sophie to try on several dresses, each one carefully selected to make an impression without being too obvious. He accompanied her to the fitting, watching as she emerged from the dressing room in each gown, her posture regal, her movements fluid. She seemed to inhabit each dress fully, as if she were reclaiming a part of herself that had been lost along the way. Each time she stepped out, she held his gaze, her expression unreadable, challenging him silently, as if daring him to see her as she truly was, beyond the labels, beyond the assumptions. At last, she chose a simple yet elegant gown, a deep navy blue that complemented her dark hair and brought out the intensity of her eyes. She looked stunning, and for a moment, Adam found himself struggling to find words. She raised an eyebrow, a smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth. "What?" she asked, feigning innocence. He shook his head, managing a small smile. "Nothing. You just look incredible." Sophie chuckled, rolling her eyes. "I'd say thank you. But somehow, I don't think you're used to giving compliments." Adam laughed, feeling a flush of embarrassment, though he quickly covered it with a shrug. "I give credit where it's due." They stood there in silence for a moment, the air between them charged with an unspoken energy. Neither of them moved, each seemingly waiting for the other to break the moment, to say something that might ease the tension. But instead, they simply stood there, caught in the realization that what they'd started as a business arrangement had grown into something else entirely. They both sensed it, this undeniable connection that defied logic, and yet neither dared to acknowledge it outright. Finally, Sophie turned away, her gaze softening as she looked at her reflection in the mirror. She looked like someone she barely recognized, someone she hadn't seen in years. And as she straightened her shoulders, she felt a surge of both hope and fear, an overwhelming sense of stepping back into a world she'd once belonged to, and yet felt completely alienated from. Adam watched her, feeling a pang of something he couldn't quite name, a mixture of admiration, protectiveness, and something deeper, something that felt dangerously close to affection. He'd entered this arrangement to prove something to himself, to Rachel, to the world. But now, as he looked at Sophie, he realized that he no longer cared about appearances or pride. He cared about something more, something that terrified him and thrilled him all at once. And as they left the fitting room side by side, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life, once so neatly planned and predictable, had taken a turn he could never have anticipated. The day of the wedding arrived, and Adam found himself waiting for Sophie in the grand lobby of his penthouse, his thoughts spiraling in ways he hadn't anticipated. He had spent days meticulously planning every aspect of this arrangement, from her clothes to her grooming to the quiet rehearsals of social protocol. And yet, as he stood there, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, he realized he wasn't prepared at all. This wasn't the scenario he had envisioned. Instead of feeling smug satisfaction at showing up with a remarkable companion by his side, he felt an odd sense of anxiety, the kind that unsettled his usually unshakable demeanor. When Sophie finally appeared at the top of the staircase, Adam's breath caught in his throat. She looked utterly stunning, even beyond what he had expected. The deep navy gown she had chosen hugged her figure elegantly. Her hair swept back in a way that showcased her striking features. She was poised, almost regal, descending the stairs with a grace that felt entirely natural, as though this world, this setting, had always been hers. In that moment, Adam could barely remember the woman he had met on the street. Here stood someone entirely transformed, and yet undeniably herself. She looked at him with a hint of amusement, clearly aware of his reaction, though she made no comment on it. Instead, she simply offered her hand. Her chin tilted slightly, as if daring him to say something, to break the silence that hung thick in the air between them. Adam took her hand, feeling a surge of warmth that made him momentarily forget his surroundings. Her fingers were delicate but strong, her grip confident, and he found himself holding onto her hand a moment longer than necessary. She gave him a small, knowing smile, and he quickly released her hand, clearing his throat. "Shall we?" he managed to say, masking his nervousness with a faint smile. She nodded, her expression unreadable, though her eyes held a glimmer of excitement, or perhaps curiosity. The car ride to the wedding was a strange mix of tension and camaraderie. They sat close, yet not touching, their conversation flowing easily, but with an undercurrent of something unspoken. Adam found himself watching her out of the corner of his eye, noticing the way she glanced out the window, her expression contemplative. He wondered what was going through her mind, if she was thinking about the people they would encounter, or perhaps remembering moments from a past life she rarely spoke about. There was an intensity in her gaze that made him want to reach out, to ask her about those hidden parts of herself, but he held back, sensing that tonight wasn't the time. When they arrived at the wedding venue, a sprawling estate adorned with flowers and soft lights, Sophie paused at the entrance, taking it all in. Adam could sense her hesitation, the slight catch in her breath as she looked around, her eyes tracing over the grand architecture, the perfectly manicured gardens, the guests who moved in graceful, effortless groups. She took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and looked at him with a steady gaze, as if to say, "I'm ready." He offered her his arm, and together they stepped into the crowd, their presence drawing immediate attention. As they moved through the gathering, heads turned, whispers followed them, and Adam could feel the weight of countless eyes. He had anticipated this reaction, of course, bringing someone like Sophie, with her striking beauty and poised demeanor, was bound to make an impression. Yet he hadn't expected the warmth in her smile, the effortless way she spoke to strangers, the confidence that radiated from her, as if this world had always been hers. She mingled with the guests, charming them effortlessly, and Adam found himself watching her with a mixture of pride and admiration. At one point, they were approached by a group of Adam's old friends, including Rachel's close circle. Sophie held her own with ease, engaging them in conversation, her responses sharp and insightful, even playful. She laughed, her voice genuine, and Adam noticed how the others leaned in, captivated by her. It wasn't just her appearance, he realized. It was her essence, the undeniable strength and resilience that came through in every word, every gesture. Rachel herself noticed them, her gaze lingering on Sophie, her expression a mixture of surprise and something else. For a moment, Adam thought he saw a flicker of jealousy in her eyes, though she quickly masked it with a polite smile as she approached them. "Adam," Rachel greeted, her tone cordial, though there was a strain beneath the politeness. Her gaze flicked to Sophie, assessing her with thinly veiled curiosity. "You must be Sophie. I've heard a lot about you." Sophie smiled warmly, her eyes meeting Rachel's with a confidence that was both disarming and bold. "I'm honored," she replied, her voice steady. "And congratulations, by the way. It's a beautiful wedding." Rachel's smile tightened slightly, though she maintained her composure. "Thank you. Adam has always had interesting tastes." Her tone was light, but the implication was clear, a subtle jab that Adam couldn't ignore. He felt a surge of anger, but before he could respond, Sophie spoke, her tone calm and measured. "I'm sure he does," Sophie replied smoothly, her eyes twinkling with a hint of mischief. "After all, he did choose you once." A brief silence fell between them, the subtle tension palpable. Adam watched as Rachel's expression faltered just for a moment, and he had to suppress a smile. Sophie had deflected Rachel's comment with grace and subtlety, turning it into something almost complimentary, yet with an edge that left Rachel momentarily speechless. Adam felt a surge of pride, an undeniable sense of admiration for Sophie's ability to handle herself in even the most delicate social situations. She had not only held her own, but subtly shifted the power dynamic, leaving Rachel visibly unsettled. As the evening wore on, Adam found himself increasingly captivated by Sophie, unable to look away from her as she moved through the crowd, engaging effortlessly with guests who were both charmed and intrigued by her. He had initially thought she might feel out of place, or that she would rely on him for support, but instead she had taken command of the evening, fitting into his world with an ease that surprised even him. Later in the evening, as they stepped out onto the terrace to escape the crowd, Adam finally let his guard down, allowing himself to relax beside her. They stood in comfortable silence, looking out over the estate, the sounds of laughter and music drifting softly behind them. He turned to her, his voice quiet, almost hesitant. "Thank you, Sophie. I don't know if I could have done this alone." She glanced at him, her expression softening, her eyes reflecting a rare vulnerability. "You could have," she replied, "but maybe you shouldn't have had to." Adam studied her, feeling a sudden, intense urge to reach out, to pull her close, to bridge the gap between them that seemed to grow and shrink all at once. But before he could act on his impulse, Sophie looked away, her gaze distant, her thoughts clearly elsewhere. It was then that he realized there were still parts of her he hadn't touched, parts of her past that remained shrouded in mystery. And he wondered if he would ever truly understand the depths of who she was. The morning after the wedding, Adam felt a restless energy, as though something had shifted, something he couldn't quite grasp. He found himself thinking about Sophie's laughter, the way she had held her own, the way she had effortlessly navigated the social maze that made up his world. But most of all, he thought about the brief moment on the terrace, the look in her eyes that had hinted at something deeper, something he hadn't yet reached. Later that day, Adam received a call from one of his father's old business associates, a man who rarely contacted him directly. There was a strange tone in his voice, a hint of discomfort as he mentioned a scandal involving Whitfield Industries, one that had been quietly buried years ago. As Adam listened, a realization began to take shape, a cold, sinking feeling settling in his stomach. The details matched fragments of Sophie's story. The corporate job she had lost, the reputation that had been ruined, the pieces she had shared with him in passing, pieces he hadn't fully connected until now. After the call ended, Adam sat in silence, the weight of the revelation pressing down on him. He couldn't ignore the implications, couldn't pretend that his family's company had been uninvolved. There was no denying it. Whitfield Industries had been a part of what had destroyed Sophie's life. And though he had known his family wasn't perfect, he hadn't realized the extent of the harm they had caused, hadn't seen the ripple effects that had shattered lives in ways he was only beginning to comprehend. When he finally saw Sophie again, he felt an overwhelming sense of guilt, though he wasn't sure how to express it. She looked at him, sensing something was amiss, her gaze sharp, perceptive. "What is it?" she asked quietly, her tone careful. Adam hesitated, then took a deep breath, meeting her gaze. "Sophie, I found out something about my family, about Whitfield Industries, and it involves you." She watched him in silence, her expression unreadable, though he could see a flicker of pain in her eyes, a glimmer of something she had kept buried. He felt the urge to apologize, to find a way to make it right. But the words felt hollow, inadequate. Instead, he reached out, gently taking her hand, a silent gesture of support, of understanding, of a promise that he would do whatever he could to help her find justice. Sophie looked at him, her gaze softening, though her eyes held a quiet resolve, a strength that seemed to grow with each passing moment. And as they stood there, hand in hand, Adam knew that whatever came next, they would face it together, bound by a truth that had reshaped both their lives, a truth that would lead them down a path neither had anticipated, a path toward redemption, justice, and a future they had yet to define. The decision to confront Whitfield Industries did not come easily. Adam and Sophie spent hours talking through their options, wrestling with the gravity of the revelations. For Adam, the choice felt like a betrayal, a turning point that severed him from his family's legacy. He'd grown up believing in the power and respect his family's name commanded, had seen the empire his father had built as a symbol of success. But now, knowing what Whitfield Industries had done, he could no longer stand behind the empire that had caused Sophie's downfall, that had tarnished her career and reputation so ruthlessly. Sophie, meanwhile, was resolute. She had lost so much, faced the scorn of people who had once respected her, had endured the cold, judgmental stares from colleagues, the relentless whispers that followed her wherever she went. For years, she had carried that weight alone, resigned to the life she now led. But with Adam's support, she felt the stirrings of hope, the possibility of justice, a chance to regain a piece of herself that had been stolen. She was determined to stand up, not just for herself, but for the others she knew had also been victims of Whitfield Industries' corruption. And as they talked, Adam found himself drawn to her resolve, her strength feeding his own. Together, they planned the press conference, every detail meticulously arranged to reveal the truth about Whitfield Industries. They coordinated with journalists, lawyers, and investigators who had been waiting for someone with Adam's influence to step forward. There were moments when Adam doubted himself, when he wondered if he was doing the right thing, if he was prepared to face the consequences. But every time he looked at Sophie, her unwavering conviction reminded him of why they were doing this, why he couldn't allow his family's actions to go unchallenged. The morning of the press conference, Adam felt a surge of anxiety he hadn't anticipated. As he dressed in front of the mirror, his mind raced with thoughts of his father, of the fallout this would cause within his family, of the people who would judge him for going public. He was about to step out into the world as a different man, a man who rejected the privileges and power he had once cherished. Sophie's hand on his shoulder brought him back to the present, grounding him, giving him the courage he needed. She met his gaze, her eyes filled with a quiet, reassuring strength. "We're doing the right thing, Adam," she whispered, her voice steady. He nodded, drawing comfort from her presence, the knowledge that she was beside him in this fight. As they entered the conference room, flashes from cameras and murmurs from the assembled reporters filled the air. Adam took his place at the podium, his gaze scanning the crowd, feeling the weight of their expectations. Beside him, Sophie stood tall, her expression calm, determined. This was her moment too, her chance to reclaim her story, to tell the world the truth that had been hidden for so long. Adam took a deep breath, his voice steady as he began to speak, recounting the story of corruption, greed, and betrayal that lay at the heart of Whitfield Industries. Sophie shared her own experience, her voice unwavering as she recounted the events that had led to her unjust dismissal, the reputational damage she had endured, the loss of everything she had once held dear. She spoke not with anger, but with dignity, her words powerful, cutting through the silence in the room. The audience listened in rapt attention, their expressions a mix of shock, empathy, and disbelief. Adam watched her, a surge of admiration and pride filling him as she stood there, reclaiming her voice, her story. The press conference took an unexpected turn when Paul Sinclair, a former high-ranking executive from Whitfield Industries, stood up and asked to speak. Adam recognized him instantly. Paul had been a close associate of his father, a man Adam had seen at family gatherings, at board meetings. He hadn't anticipated seeing him here, but the look on Paul's face was one of grim determination, a man who had clearly wrestled with his own conscience. Paul approached the podium, clearing his throat, his voice rough with emotion. "I was part of the cover-up," he confessed, his words hanging heavily in the air. He detailed his involvement in the scandal, his own part in the decisions that had destroyed lives. There was a pause, a ripple of shock through the room as he admitted his complicity. "I stayed silent for too long. But seeing someone finally brave enough to speak out, it's given me the courage to do the same." Adam watched as the crowd reacted, their questions sharp, probing, relentless. Paul's confession added weight to their story, lending credibility that no amount of evidence alone could have conveyed. For the first time, Adam felt a glimmer of hope that their stand might lead to real change, that the truth might finally come to light in a way that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. But he also knew that his father's reaction would be fierce, unyielding, that this betrayal would sever the last remnants of their relationship. Later that evening, Adam returned home to find his father waiting for him, his expression dark, filled with an anger that Adam had never seen before. His father's voice was sharp, cutting, his accusations filled with bitterness, calling Adam ungrateful, foolish, accusing him of destroying everything their family had built. Adam stood his ground, refusing to back down, his voice steady as he defended his actions, as he explained that he couldn't stand by while lives were ruined, while innocent people like Sophie were left to suffer. The confrontation was painful, the words harsh, each one cutting deeper than the last. His father's betrayal ran deep, not just because of the scandal, but because Adam had dared to stand against him, had chosen justice over loyalty. Adam could see the pain in his father's eyes, the hurt and disbelief that his own son could turn against him. But he also saw the unrepentant pride, the stubborn refusal to admit any wrongdoing, the belief that their power and influence made them untouchable. And in that moment, Adam knew that he had made the right choice, that he couldn't be part of a legacy built on lies and suffering. After his father left, Adam found Sophie waiting for him, her presence a balm to the wounds inflicted by the confrontation. She didn't ask questions, didn't press him to talk about what had happened. Instead, she simply sat beside him, her hand resting on his, her presence enough to remind him of the purpose behind his actions. Together, they had torn down the walls of deceit and corruption, had confronted the darkness that had overshadowed their lives. And now they were free to build something new, something honest, something that reflected the values they both held dear. In the weeks that followed, the public response was overwhelming. Sophie became a symbol of resilience, of courage, her story resonating with people who had faced similar injustices, who had been silenced by the powerful. Adam's decision to expose his own family's corruption was met with a mixture of admiration and disbelief, the media casting him as both a hero and a pariah. But for Adam, the opinions of others mattered little. He had done what he believed was right, had stood beside Sophie as they confronted a world that had tried to silence them. And in doing so, he had found a sense of purpose, a clarity he hadn't felt in years. One afternoon, Adam met with Rachel. She had reached out to him after hearing about the press conference, and he agreed to meet her, curious to see how she would respond to the changes in his life. When they met, Rachel looked at him with a mixture of sadness and admiration, her voice soft as she expressed her surprise at the man he had become. "I always knew you had potential, Adam," she said, her tone reflective. "But I never expected you to take such a bold stand. I respect that, and I hope you find happiness." Their conversation was brief, a closure of sorts, an acknowledgement that they had both moved on, had found different paths. Rachel wished him well, and as they parted, Adam felt a sense of peace, a release from the past, a readiness to embrace the future. Later that evening, he found Sophie on the rooftop of his penthouse, staring out over the city lights. She turned as he approached, a smile softening her features, her gaze filled with warmth and gratitude. Adam took her hand, his voice filled with a quiet intensity as he spoke. "Sophie, I know that what we've been through has changed everything, and I want to be by your side, to build something with you, something real, something honest." Sophie looked at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears, her voice barely a whisper as she replied, "Adam, I never imagined finding someone who would fight for me, who would stand beside me. But with you, I feel like I can finally begin again, like I can face the future without fear." They stood together, hand in hand, the city stretching out before them, a symbol of the challenges and possibilities that lay ahead. Adam knew that their journey was far from over, that there would be obstacles, trials, moments of doubt. But he also knew that with Sophie beside him, he could face whatever came, could build a life grounded in truth, integrity, and love. As they embraced, a sense of hope filled the air, a quiet, unspoken promise that they would face the future together, that they would rewrite their stories, would create a legacy that would honor the values they held dear. And in that moment, they were more than just survivors of a broken system. They were architects of a new beginning, a vision for a world that could be, a world built on compassion, justice, and a love that had endured against all odds.